So there are two kinds of programming, as we all know. One is synchronous and another one is asynchronous. So JavaScript is synchronous. It is sequential. It has to wait for the completion of the previous statement before it can pick up the execution of the next statement. So one after the other. So that is synchronous programming, right? So what is the problem with synchronous programming? Now, as we saw, if there is a long wait operation, it is very performance intensive. So it has to wait for the step to complete, then only it can go to the next step. So that is where your asynchronous programming comes into picture, right? It need not wait for one step to complete. It can asynchronously, it can parallelly do certain things, right? So that is called asynchronous programming. So there are four ways in which you can do asynchronous programming in Node, which I have listed down here. The first and foremost is a callback way, which is a very preliminary way of doing it. The second is using an async library, and third is using promises, and the fourth is using async await method. Right? So let's first have a look at what is a callback way. I think now you should have a better understanding of what is a callback. You give a work, the work gets done, and the callback function gets triggered, right? So let us look at how to write in a how to code in callback way, right? Okay, let us close this now. Let us go back to our file explorer and let's open a new file, and let me call it as um, say I want to do add numbers. So I'll say add.js. So let's take a very simple example of how to add two numbers, right? So let's write a normal program. So how do you usually add two numbers? Let me say function add number, or let me say add, and then this method should take two arguments. One is a and one is b, which we'll have to add, and then I'll say return a plus b, right? And then I say um, add of 1 comma 1, right? So we'll also have to print this, right? So let me say, let me also write a function print of, and let me say this is sum, right? And I'll say console.log of, let me say the sum is this. Okay, so I can also say where sum is equal to this, and I can say print of sum. So this is how we usually write a normal addition program, right? So what I can do is node add.js. So I can get the sum is 2, right? I want to add it like 3 more times, right? So I want to add 1 and 2, 1 and 3, right? So what happens? I get sum is 2, 3, 4, right? So I've got all this. Now, what if I want to, instead of me invoking this print for by waiting for the result of sum and then I invoking this, what if I can call it back as soon as my result is available in the addition method, right? So what I can say is I'm going to pass this add method a callback function, and that is called print. So let's remove this additional code of calling the print separately each and every time, right? So I'm going to pass the print method or the print function, which is the callback for me. So this is the callback function that add has to invoke after the completion of addition. So now I have sum, which holds the sum of a plus b, and once my work is done, I can call print of sum. Right now, all these assignments are all not required. Does it simplify? Yes, right? It has simplified our code to a great extent. Now let's see what happens, right? The same output. So this is a callback way of getting things done. You pass the method which has to be called back once your actual work is done. Let's look at a more meaningful example. Try to give a timeout and see how it actually creates a difference. How you can see asynchronous programming actually working here, right? So let me create a new file. Let's go with the timeout example, right? So let me say callback timeout, okay, .js, right? And let me write a very simple program to print three numbers. Function perform some task of printing three numbers, right? I can say console.log of say 1, right? And I want to print 2 and 3. 2 and this is 3, right? Now if I want to invoke this, I can say perform task of, right? Let's see how this works. You can see 1, 2, 3 printed one after the other sequentially, right? Suppose now I want to give a timeout here, right? What do I do? Set timeout. Set timeout is a method which is like available for you, ready-made, right? So I can say set timeout of, and there is a function which you can pass here, right? And this is the function which I'm going to extract out and write, because we are not used to ES6 syntax so far. This is written ES6 ECMAScript 6 syntax. Let's not go with that. Let's not get confused as of now. Let's go with a normal function. Let me call that function as a callback, right? So this I'm going to write inside the function called callback function. This is my callback function which has to be called after my timeout of 2 seconds is done, right? I want to print 1 and I want to give a 2 seconds timeout, and then I want to print the word 2 and then I want to print 3. Let's see how this works. So as you can see here, 1 gets printed. It doesn't wait for the timeout. It goes to the next line. After 2 seconds, it prints 2, right? So this is how a callback. So if you see here, I'm passing the callback function as the first parameter here. So this is a very good example to demonstrate how callback works, right? Now going back to our example, this is a very difficult way to write our code, right? So if you see now that our example is very simple, but what if you have a lot of ifs and elses? So passing back and forth the callback function can make the code quite messy, and error handling also becomes very difficult. So that is why it's not a very much preferred way of writing. So there is another option to it, that is async library. So async library is a library which is available and which you can use to attain a similar uh, behavior, right? So let's have a look at how async library works. Let's create a new file, right? And let's call it. Where again, I'm going to show you how adding two numbers can be done in all four methods of asynchronous programming, right? So let's call it as async add .js, right? So first of all, it's a library. So we'll have to invoke require the library here, import the library here, right? So async is equal to require of async is my library, right? Now, so I will have to add the two numbers, right? So the function remains the same. So the add function remains the same. So let me say function add of, and it takes two parameters a and b, and I say var sum z a plus b, right? And then I can say return sum. So my addition method is going to remain the same, and so is my print function also. I think I can better copy from the print function from here, and this is my print function, and I can say this, I want to print the sum. Now I can say there are many methods available in the async library like series or waterfall or there are many libraries for you to use. I have used the series function. There are many functions for you to use. I have used the series function to demonstrate how the results get accumulated at one function, one callback function, and then you can print all of them. So let's see, async dot series of, right? And then I can say, let me say 1 colon function of callback, and then I say where sum is equal to add is my function to do the addition. I say 1 comma 1, right? Once this addition is done, I will have to make a callback function, right? Function call. So callback of null comma sum. I have to pass this sum to a callback function. Now, how do I define the callback function here? I can say comma function. If there is any error, it will give me the error here, or it will give me the values, the results, right? And then I can say this is the callback function, and I can say console.log of values, right? Let me format the code, right? So likewise, you can do more additions here. Say I want to do 2 and I want to add 1 and 2. I want to do 3 and I want to add 1 and 3, right? So I'm doing a series of asynchronous actions and then I'm accumulating all the callbacks, and finally my callback gets called here, right? So let's see what happens. Async add. Yes, there we go. We have an error. So what is the error? Cannot find module async, right? So this error brings us to understand why async module is not present, because it's a third party module, right? So I will have to import the module. I'll have to install the module first. So util and http were all core modules which were all readily available when I install Node itself. But async is a third party module which I will have to install, right? So how do I install? I'll have to do npm install, and then what is my module name? Async hyphen hyphen save. Now let's understand what this command does. npm is a node package manager. So this is a package. Async is a package, and we'll have to include that package in my uh, application. And hyphen hyphen save saves it as a dependency in my package.json file, right? So once I do this, it is going to pull my dependency and it's going to create a node modules folder for me, which is going to have a folder called async in it. This is the first node module which we have used, and if you can see, it has created a node modules folder here, and it has also created me a package log file here, right? So as you can see here, it has created the async. This is a node module, and this in turn has all the dependent files within itself, right? As you can see here. Now that we have included async in ours, let's see how our code works. I'm sorry, I have made it as callback. It has to be CB. That is the name of our callback function. There you go. So you get the addition of all the numbers together in a single callback function. 2, 3, and 4. So this is how async works, right? So let's look at another example to really get the flavor of async programming. So let's take the same timeout example and try to create, right? So let me call it as async timeout, right, dot js, right? So let me see, same, it still holds good. I will have to import the async module here, right? I have imported the async module here, and then all the structure goes the same. So let me just copy and then show you what is it that it is going to differ, right? So this is all not required. Now our job is to say that I want to print 1, 2 or 3, right? So I can say this is my actual executor. This is the actual work that is done here, right? So there is no sum that is required for me, right? There is no sum that is actually required for me. So I'll have to give a timeout. So I have to demonstrate how timeout works for you. So I will do a timeout of, and then I'm going to write a function. A function can be a expression also. So instead of creating a separate callback function, let me show you how to write it as an expression function, function expression function, and then I say this, right? And I want to give a timeout of 2 seconds. And what should I do after the timeout of 2 seconds? I want to send the value of 1, right? Same way here, right? I want to send the value of 2. Same way here, I want to send the value of 3, right? So you give a timeout of 2 seconds and then invoke my callback function, which is this. So let's see how it works. Sorry, I'm executing async add again. Let me see how async timeout works. So as you can see, it has, each of them have waited for 2 seconds each, and then it has printed the output 1, 2 and 3, right? So this is how async library works. Now let's look at how the third asynchronous way of programming is promises, right? Promises is one of the most famous and the most the neat way of doing things. Let's see how we can do it in promises, right? So a promise is nothing but it's an asynchronous function, right? So let's look at the same example of adding the addition function add. I can say a comma b, right? Now, instead of returning the sum itself, I'm going to return a promise which is going to resolve into a success or a failure, right? So, how do I return a promise? So, return, I can say new promise of, right? The promise constructor is going to take a function as an input. So, what is my function? So, my function is going to take 2 arguments again, right? So my function is going to take 2 arguments. One is a function which is going to be called when my promise is successfully resolved. Another one is when my promise is rejected. So resolve and reject. Success are during success and during failure, right? Whatever I write inside this is the executor. This is the actual body of my executor. So here I can do where sum is equal to a plus b, right? So now let me save the file. I can say add promise dot js, right? So here now my addition is my job is successfully completed. So I can say resolve of, right? I'm going to resolve the promise. So once my job is completed, my promise should be resolved. Let's try to add the other functions as is. I need my print method here to print the output for me, right? Now, how do I invoke the add method? Right? Same as I do add of 1 comma 1. Right? So now the first example of callback, you pass the callback back to the function. Now we don't have to pass. Since it's a promise, it will let us know what happens. Dot then. There is a dot then method which will tell you when my promise is resolved, do this. So you can write a function inside your then. Right? So when my promise is resolved, do this. I want to print. Right? So whatever you pass as arguments here for the resolve becomes your parameter for this function. So you can pass resolve of sum, and you can take that argument here and you can say print of sum. I can do the same addition n number of times here. I can say 1 comma 1, and I can say 1 comma 2, and I can say 1 comma 3. Right? So this is a promise. This promise can either be resolved or rejected based on my body that gets executed here. Right? So now let's see how it works. This is add promise. There you go. You have 2, 3, 4, which is the sum of two numbers, which is handled in a promise way. Asynchronous programming with promise. Right? Let's go back to our timeout example to get a more real-time flavor of how it works. Right? So I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it timeout promise. Right? And then let's say function. So let's go back to our old function and let's copy the code, the callback timeout. Let's copy the code. This is the function which is going to print me the three numbers with timeout, right? So what is going to change here is this part. So the timeout and the callback is going to change in the way in which we are going to do, right? So let's define a function which will return me a promise. So what is that function going to be? Function is going to return me a promise. So I will say function wait for me, right? And I will say wait for me this much of time, right? And I'll have to return a promise here. Return new promise, right? Promise constructor takes a function as an argument, and the function in turn takes two arguments, which is resolve and reject. Right? What am I going to do in this promise? This promise is going to resolve into success when my timeout is going to be achieved. Right? So my timeout is nothing but this value is nothing but is passed for me delay. And this function, I'm going to keep it simple. Right? We'll remove the ES6 syntax and we'll just um, make it resolve. Right? So I'm going to call the resolve function to resolve the promise after the delay that is passed, maybe 2 seconds or 3 seconds. Right? So wait for me for 2 seconds. Right? So this function will have to be, I've not used this function yet, right? Wait for me, I've not used yet. Let us remove this. And how do I use it now? So I will say wait for me, wait for me for 2 seconds, and then also takes function as an argument, and then you can do the callback. Right? So you get that you have defined a function which will wait for 2 seconds, and on timeout it will return a promise, and when the promise resolves you invoke the callback method. Right? So let us see how this works. Node timeout promise, you get 1 3, it is waiting for 2 seconds, and then your promise gets resolved, and then your callback gets called. So if we look into how it works, right? So we can see, right? So let's see how it works. I'm going to debug this. Perform task. Let me step into what is perform task, right? It prints 1 first, if you see, and then it goes back to 3. It does not go into that, right? And then you finish it once you see, and then your callback gets called, right? So this is an example for promise. Now coming to the fourth asynchronous way of programming is using async await, right? So for that, let's create a new file and call async add.js, or rather I'll say async await, right? Now our function is going to remain the same, right? So let's copy from the add promise itself. Let's copy from add promise the whole code, right? An asynchronous function is nothing but a function which runs asynchronously, right? So now which function is the one which is going to run asynchronously for us? We'll have to figure that out right now. So let's keep the print as is, right? And let's keep the add also as is, because it's going to return a promise. It is going to return it's going to print the value, right? And then instead of writing all of this, I can just write another function which will say function make sum, function make sum, and then it is going to take two arguments, a and b, right? And this is my async function. I'm going to call this function as an async function. Now instead of calling add, I'm going to call, let's remove all of this at the bottom. I'm going to call make sum of, I'll say 1 comma 1 comma 1, and then let me say 1 comma 2 and 1 comma 3. Now I'm going to call this method which is going to make the sum. So how is it going to make the sum of two numbers? It is going to call the function add of a comma b, right? So this is a simple example, but in real time assume that this is a very complex method and this is going to take a lot of um, um, take a lot of IO weight, and I'm going to await on this function. I'm going to await on this function which does a very complex job, right? And the result of my very complex job is the sum of these two numbers, right? Now I can just say print of sum, right? So these two remains the same. This is a very complex method which does the sum of two numbers, which returns the promise, and this is a function which prints the sum. And I'm going to write an asynchronous function which is going to await on a promise, and once the promise resolves, it is going to do the next set of actions. So let's see how it works. So this is node async await add. So as you can see, it has printed 2, 3, and 4. So this is how you use async await. Just assume that my add is a very complex function and it is going to have a lot of waiting time, right? So let's extend the same logic to my timeout example. So let's say async await timeout.js, right? So let's go back to our previous promise example, because it's nothing but waiting on a promise, right? So let's use this, right? So I'm going to wait. My async function is going to wait on a promise. So let's create an async function first. So my async function is nothing but function. I will say wait for my return. Wait for my return. And then I say this, right? Wait for my return and I say this, and this is my delay for how much time I will have to wait, right? And I am going to wait on which is my long running which is my IO away IO intensive function here. Wait for me. Just assume that though it is 2 seconds, but real time it may be more. I'll say wait for me for I'll say sorry, let it will be the delay itself. Wait for me for the delay. I'm going to await on this function, and then I am going to say callback. Rather, let me rename it. I'll say mm, let's just remove this function itself, and then I'll print 2, right? So perform task, I'm gonna say wait for me, right? Instead of wait for me, I'll have to say wait for my return, because I'm gonna invoke the async function, which is wait for my return, which is 2000 milliseconds, which is 2 seconds. And then this function is waiting on a promise, waiting on a function which returns a promise. Once it is returned, it prints 2. So let's see how it works. I'll say node async await timeout. So there you go. Get 1, 3 and it waits for 2 seconds and then it prints 2. So these are the 4 different ways in in which you can do asynchronous programming with Node. My personal choice of asynchronous programming out of these 4 ways is the last one, which is using async await, because it makes it so simple and makes the code so readable that the keywords itself indicate that this is an asynchronous function. I'm waiting on this promise. So it makes it all much more readable and much more easier to understand.